Yes, so I'm John Doyle. I'm a lawyer for the Scottish Government, primarily based in Edinburgh, but I spend a lot of time in Brussels. I've only recently rejoined the Scottish Government's Legal Directorate. I spent the past 6 years as the Head of Justice and Home Affairs for the Scottish Government in Brussels in a diplomatic post. So a bit of a combination between diplomacy, policy, and legal skills. Before that, I had worked in the Scottish Government Legal Directorate in Edinburgh. I trained at one of the big commercial firms. Say more about that as you like.
Perfect, thank you. So, what first drew you to study law, and what first drew you to study in Edinburgh?
So, and maybe not the most positive story, I had applied to, well, I wanted to do law because Um, I didn't really know what I fancied doing, and I didn't really have any kind of sense of vocation. Kind of had done pretty well in my exams, and it was a total chance. I was in a corner shop in Glasgow with my dad, and my dad met a guy he was at school with who happened to be a criminal defence solicitor in Glasgow, and my dad kind of, without really asking me, went, "Oh, do you want to do?" My son wants to do work experience with you. So I ended up doing work experience with a solicitor in Glasgow Sheriff Court, and I must have been about 16. And I remember thinking, these people are probably hilarious. They were really funny. They were all really quick witted. They were really sharp. And I think when I was 16, adults were a very intimidating bunch. People talking about, your job and your career. And suddenly these people I thought were ridiculous. They were funny. They didn't seem to take themselves very seriously. And that, as an unserious person myself, that was quite an attractive, oh, this is what you can go do. And that then led to me that maybe I could do law. And then I also thought it was really attractive that with studying law, while there was a career you could kind of quite easily go into, relatively easily, you weren't really, it wasn't compulsory. You could do something else. You could go do other things, and that's exactly what I've ended up doing, is doing other things. So I found that flexibility quite attractive. I thought a lot of the lawyers I'd met were quite interesting and fun people. So that was the two big drivers. When I went to Edinburgh, I'm from the West Coast, so I just had always assumed I would go to Glasgow or Strathclyde. And then, somewhat hilariously, the day I had to pick I got offers from Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Strathclyde. On the day I had to choose, I fell out with my mum, and so I marched upstairs and I was like, "I'm moving out," and I picked Edinburgh because it meant I would have to move away, and that took about a year for that decision to settle down. That was frankly a terrible basis upon which to go to university, but I really didn't regret it. I mean, as I moved out from my parents when I was 17. I went to Edinburgh. I loved Edinburgh. Actually, one thing I thought was attractive about Edinburgh, this is maybe not the case now, particularly with Brexit, they offered an Erasmus exchange that didn't mean you had to do an extra year. So they would do a 4-year degree, your Erasmus year counted. Glasgow and Strathclyde both made you do an extra year. Foolishly, I wish I had done an extra year at uni because being a student is great. But at the time, I felt a kind of pressure to graduate, which, full of regrets. But anyway, that's part of the reason why I went to Edinburgh.
Oh, perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you think studying on that year abroad or in the Erasmus scheme is something that you'd recommend? Like, did you enjoy your time? What sort of classes did you take, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, the headline message is that year shaped basically everything about the rest of my life. I can't really, I mean, that's professional, personal, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But obviously, this is coming from a time when the UK was a member of the European Union, and this was kind of normal. I mean, we're talking, it was 2010 when I went away, so Brexit hadn't even really been thought of as a word yet. But yeah, I was 19 when I moved to Belgium. I did my Erasmus at the KU Leuven. Again, on a ridiculous basis, I was either going to go to Copenhagen, Maastricht, or Leuven, and I went to Leuven because someone told me they've got the cheapest beer, and I was like, I'm not going to be well off when I'm abroad. I'll just go and drink cheap beer. I should say, actually, I'd started doing law and French originally at Edinburgh, and I dropped French after first year, largely because I didn't really enjoy the language learning at Edinburgh. I didn't feel I was improving in the language. My classes were largely in English, which I thought was a bit baffling. And I wanted to just focus on learning the language rather than, because I'm a simple man, rather than looking at kind of obscure medieval French poetry. I wanted to speak French. So I ditched French, and then wanted to stay in a kind of French speaking country if possible. And Belgium had the kind of Dutch and French. And um, I started learning Dutch. I went out early and did a month-long intensive Dutch course, which has completely changed the rest of my life. I've lived in the Netherlands. My wife is Dutch. Like, being a Dutch speaker is a big chunk of my life, so that had a big impact. But yeah, going on Erasmus, going on an exchange, is, I think, one of the best things you can ever do. And I find it interesting now, the number of my friends that didn't do it, they almost all consistently regret not doing it, because the older you get a mortgage, you get settled down, you get kids, it's a little bit harder to just up sticks and move away to another place without consequences. So highly recommend it. I focused on European and international law. Again, this was kind of where the beginning of my career started, where I did European criminal law, European international criminal law, European constitutional law, all of that. I started to kind of shape my interests. Obviously, being in Belgium, I was near lots of the institutions, went to The Hague a few times. And that meant that when I came back to do my fourth year at Edinburgh, I kind of already knew I wanted to go back to the continent. I wanted to live there again. I wasn't quite ready to settle back into Scotland. But yeah, if you ever get the chance to go abroad, do it, even if it's only for 6 months. I think the UK is going to rejoin Erasmus pretty soon. And I should say, I think when I was at uni, Erasmus was presented very much as it's this structure, you do it at this period, you can't do it again. There's tons of Erasmus opportunities that kind of take place outside of the formal structures. You can set them up yourselves. You can still get funding. There's Erasmus Plus, there's Erasmus Mundus. All those kind of things are there and worth exploring, just for the chance to go do something different.
Perfect, thanks. Well, Kieran and I are both at the situation where we could have went on a year abroad, and
Yeah, I think we both maybe already.
Yeah, we already went. We already
yeah.
We wish we had a little bit.
Yeah, sorry to say that, but it's quite funny because like my brother does medicine at Dundee, and he's just done. He'd always been like, doctors can't do this, and I was like that's absolutely not true. You definitely can. He's just done 8 weeks in Southeast Asia and Malaysia and everything like that, and it really was just a case of he emailed some hospitals, got some funding, and just went off and did it. And I was like, there's nothing stopping you if you decide you want to do these things. There's often a way to do it. So I think the general point of my advice to people is don't listen to people. Just go try and do it yourself. And then it tends to work. So you can still go do some sort of exchange. If you found the time, you try and find some funding, there's ways to do it. So don't give up the dream.
Thank you very much. So was there any other particular academic experiences, like such as mooting or research projects, anything like that, that's like had a really lasting influence on your direction?
Yes, absolutely. So when this is kind of not a very positive story. When I came back in fourth year, had a decent year, but I had just not teed up a traineeship, hadn't done anything, hadn't done any summer placements. I was like just Erasmus brain, my head was on partying with my pals, and I came back to Edinburgh, and I felt like everyone was just so organised, and I was really behind the curve. So I didn't know what I was going to do, didn't have the best time, and I made a mistake in one of my exams. So at Edinburgh, you've got it's the two exams and a dissertation. If you did an exchange, everything's on that. And one of my exams, I left out 2/3 of the paper, right? Insane. But I did the thing where instead of, I for some reason I thought it was like pick one question and answer it. So I went and wrote 10 pages on one question, and it was you're meant to answer every single one. And so I'd done the exam completely wrong, and I had to go through the whole process of special circumstances and talking about it. It was really, really horrible. I thought I'd failed my degree. I really thought this is it, game over. So I came up with this kind of slight alternative plan. If I go do a master's, and the way that the master's bachelor's conversion works with honours degrees on the continent under the Bologna system at the time, I thought, well, I can still get a job if I do well at my master's because I'm never going to look at my undergrad degree. So I'd kind of created this backup. I'm getting to the point about meeting, believe me. So I went and did a master's in the Netherlands. I did public international law at the University of Leiden. Again, I spoke Dutch. I wanted to live in the Netherlands. I wanted to live in the international law institutions. So I went to the Netherlands. So The Hague made sense. Leiden's close to The Hague. I lived in The Hague. And when I was there, I didn't fail my degree, by the way. I did all right. I got 2-1, very happy with it. It worked out fine for me in the end. But it was a really bracing, horrible moment where you think, oh, I failed my whole degree. I've got to say the university were fantastic through all of that, and they were really, really good. And there is a point of if you think you've done badly, you can kind of always recover it. So that's been a nice message at the end of that. I went to Leiden, and part of the reason I went to Leiden was they take part in lots of moot competitions, like the ICE, the International Criminal Court moot, the Jessup, the Karlshoven Grieks's International Humanitarian Law Forum, and they gave you credit. You could ditch a course if you did a moot and you got to the international rounds. So I was like, lads, I'm going to do this. I would rather not do one of my courses. If I just do well at the moot, that's great. So I did the ICC moot, and long story short, I won the global moot. I was the speaker in the final. We won, and I remember having a fight with my professor at the time because in the Netherlands, your grades are out of 10. and they like no one ever gets a 10 was the whole thing. Like 9 was the highest you get. And I remember successfully arguing like I should get a 10. So my whole team should get a 10 for this course because we're the world champions. We can't do any better. And they were like, that's objectively correct. So okay, we'll give you a 10. So I got a 10 for my moot course, which was really good. But I mean, that experience, like doing a moot, like met tons of people, some I've even get in touch with. And that, so I was in the ICC procedure, they have a legal representative of victims. I was that person in the final, we won. And I then got my first internship at Amnesty International in The Hague, kind of off the back of that. So, I mean, they were really interested because they were like, oh, you know, victims procedure, you've thought about this from a victim's perspective, let's go talk. And so that was my first job. That was unpaid for a while, and then they eventually got funding for me, which was really nice. It was really difficult, and my family were supporting me. My little brother, who was like 7 or 8 at the time, had savings. He gave me his savings to help me stay in The Hague. When an 8-year-old is like, "I want to help you," that's very sweet. But that was very nice, and I think I felt very fortunate that I had that type of support that enabled me to live a kind of pretty Spartan lifestyle. I can still live in The Hague. And then from Amnesty, I worked in a couple of other places in The Hague. And yeah, mooting and all those types of experiences, I think, are hugely important. I did debating in first year at uni, and I really enjoyed it. I kind of stopped it because second year got really intense. The extracurricular stuff is really good. I think when you're coming to interviews and you're coming to applications, being able to show that you're kind of a broad-rounded human, that you've got interest, that you are human fundamentally, is quite important. And so I felt really quite fortunate that I was able to do those things. And one of the other things that, because I won the moot, I coached next year's team. Now, we didn't win, but we did get to the finals. We did really, really well. And that moot coaching experience then starts getting you into kind of thinking about leadership and start thinking about how do you teach others, rather than just being like decent yourself. How do you get others to be decent? And that was also a bit of a kind of leap forward in my career, because I could then talk about, you know, if you're 21, 22, you're not really going to be leading many people. But if you can say, like, I actually taught a team how to do this, and here's the results we reached, that's I certainly found my career quite an impressive experience to be able to talk about.
Thank you very much. That's all really interesting. Moving on from education, moving on to more about your role now, can you tell us a little bit about what your role involves and why you ended up or chose to do that? I suppose you've answered that second part a little bit already.
Yeah, I mean, I'm only 2 weeks into this current role, I've got to say, so. But I think the best way I can explain it is like, it's kind of just go from The Hague. I had worked in The Hague for 3 years. I'd been in the British Embassy. I'd been at the International Criminal Court, kind of doing internships and junior grade stuff. And then I had a boss who was a solicitor in England and Wales, and he said, "Look, if you know, I'd done my law degree, hadn't a diploma, hadn't done a traineeship, and he gave me this really good advice about, like, you're nearly always better just becoming a lawyer, become a solicitor, and if you don't do that, you can never have that taken away from you. So always just stay in the background. But there is a weird thing where people think solicitor, oh, he must be clever, or he can read, he can do stuff." And so I took the view, why don't I go back to Scotland, do diploma, do traineeship, and then I can kind of go do whatever I want. And I think the older I got, the less scary it was to spend 3 years doing something. It wasn't going to be that bad, 3 years. So I did that. I went the diploma, I got it funded because I trained at a big commercial firm. At the commercial firm, I really enjoyed it. I would have stayed there, but I also knew probably wasn't going to be my career, probably not for me. I'm not very commercially minded. I was always more interested in justice stuff. And fortunately, terrible for the country, but fortunately Brexit was happening and the Scottish Government was looking for solicitors. So I applied as an NQ, applied to join the Scottish Government, and I really enjoyed that. I was there for about 18 months working on criminal records reform, which, as a solicitor, I mean, I really am a proponent of, if you fancy being a lawyer and doing like legal thinking, the government's a great place to do it, because you're confronted with problems that, firstly, money can't solve, and secondly, no one else in the country looks at, like looking at legislation, trying to consider how to run parts of the system that are really commercial. So I love that. But when I was there, an opportunity came up to go to Brussels. There had been a Scottish solicitor in Brussels since the 70s, making sure that the positions the United Kingdom took didn't cut across the separate jurisdiction in Scotland. And I was the last solicitor in that function, because obviously we left the EU. So I got posted as a lawyer, but not working as a lawyer. And I did that for 6 years, gradually kind of taking over responsibility for things like extradition, for biometrics exchange, for police cooperation, intelligence sharing, data protection, things like that. And I've only just finished that. And so my motivation of going back to the legal director was, I've got all this EU experience, I've got all this international law experience, I've done negotiations for Scotland as part of the UK negotiation team, if you can get that. Like, you have a UK lead, but they need a kind of Scottish person or Scottish qualified lawyer to say, not give legal advice, but say, here, by the way, if you remember the Lord Advocate thing. So I wanted to make the most of that experience and bring it back to government and say, the way that the United Kingdom and EU are developing the relationship through things like the common understanding, we have to really upskill a lot of our EU law, a lot of our international law. These are things we haven't done a lot of in the past. So part of it was trying to give back to that. Part of it was, I enjoy these problems, I enjoy these things, and thinking about them. And how does, I think of negotiations I've taken part in with foreign countries, where you're trying to make sure that, like, little old Scotland's jurisdiction, the outcome will work for them, and that's interesting and it's important and it means something to the country. So that's kind of my motivation there. I should say, absolute plug the civil service. The motivation for going to the civil service was almost the exact same as becoming a lawyer. I didn't need to make a big choice. I knew I could change jobs every so often. And the variety of roles in the civil service, I think, is phenomenal. I mean, you've got the whole UK civil service to look at. There's diplomatic postings. You can be a lawyer. You can be a policy official. You can do all sorts of different things. And I think particularly for students, if there's a point where you feel like, I don't really know if I'm going to be a lawyer when I grow up, I've been a lawyer. I've stopped being a lawyer. I'm a lawyer again. You can always go back to it. But the skills you get with legal education and legal thinking are just phenomenal. And so I'd said this when I led a team of 3 people in the Scottish Government. They weren't lawyers. I would say to them, look, we're dealing with, say, extradition, the Extradition Act. Get used to it, go read it, form a view, then you know how to use lawyers better. That, I think, is quite helpful. So I'm always trying to recommend that young lawyers don't typecast themselves as, I'm just going to be a lawyer for the rest of my life. You can do other stuff. You can branch out into policy. You can use your skills elsewhere. So I would really recommend that. But yeah, sorry, a bit ranty, but there's a lot, I think, kind of messages that I hope are a bit interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, no, perfect. So you previously led teams working in International Justice Corporation. This is a bit of a two-part question. So in terms of that, what were some of the key challenges that you in that work? And then the second part is more so, what are the significant challenges currently being faced in International Justice Corporation in Europe?
So first, the challenges in the team. I mean, when you're working in International Justice Corporation, I think it's easy to forget that you're dealing with, easy to forget, I don't want to sound flippant, easy to forget you're talking about people, and there's accused persons who may be innocent, there are victims who maybe something bad's happened to them. And as civil servants, sometimes we look at problems, we try and solve them, and you're like, oh, great, good work. You need to remember there's people involved. And I said this, so we extradited people. I was responsible for extradition. That is a pretty horrible thing to happen to someone. Now we have checks and balances, we have procedures, but you bearing in mind that you are dealing with people's human rights, you're dealing with people's sense of bodily integrity. They may be accused, they may be found innocent, they could go to prison. Prison's not a very nice place to go. I think bearing that in mind, and this is why we're doing it, at the same time, the bigger picture stuff around, you're trying to achieve justice. So when someone's been raped or sexually assaulted, or a family member has been murdered, and we're trying to figure out, someone's fled to another jurisdiction, can we get them back? Can we put them in prison? Are they going to be put on trial? That is very real. So there's an emotional challenge, a personal challenge of trying not to take it too seriously. We take it very seriously. We try not to let it affect you too deeply. Sometimes it's in the media, and that's really challenging. I can think of a few very high-profile extraditions in the past few years where my wife had to take my phone off me. She was like, "Stop reading about this. Like, you're just going to get wound up." That can be difficult. I think as well, there is a certain element where every system assumes their legal system's the best, and Scotland's no exception to that. We think we're great, and then when you get a prosecutor or a judge from another system thinks their system's entirely self-explanatory. Why would you not do it this way? Trying to bridge that gap is quite difficult. And there's a lot of diplomacy goes into that. I mean, the UK has prosecutors based abroad, police officers based abroad, whose job it is to try and explain our system. That was part of my function for the Scottish system, was to explain how we did things, why we did things. And you get a lot of interesting policy exchange out of that. But there's a real challenge there. There's also a challenge in the civil service more broadly that there's always more work to do. So you're trying to work in an area where there's limited resources, there's limited time. But there was never really a day where I'd be like, I've done my work. There's always more. There's always more injustice you could fight. There's always another negotiation you could do a bit more thinking about. So part of it is learning to, what can you reasonably achieve? How do you not burn yourself out? Personal resilience can be a challenge. And even things like travel. Travel sounds exciting and sexy until you're doing it all the time, and then you're not spending much time at home. You miss your friends and family. So a big challenge. In the EU, I mean, Brexit's a huge challenge. Like, there's no other way about it. That Scotland had been part of an incredibly well integrated and sophisticated set of tools and measures for achieving justice outcomes in the European Union. We have access to lots of them through the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. We've lost a lot of access to them because of Brexit, kind of inherently, and Brexit stepping out. You can no longer do these things. So what we're trying to do, the Scottish Government, also now the UK Government, is look at ways to repair that. We can't have the same level of cooperation, but can we do things differently? It's a lot more effort, there's a lot more work involved, there's a lot more diplomacy in making friends before you need them. And that can feel a bit abstract. And I think sometimes these things aren't quite widely understood in the public mind, that you're trying to achieve domestic outcomes through the power of diplomacy, without sounding too cheesy, because these things are international. Criminality is an international problem. People move very freely. So those are challenges. And in the EU, I mean, cooperation is not perfect between the member states. They have their own challenges. They have to think about, how do you track people across borders? How do you recognise different forms of judicial outcomes, systems that hold very closely guarded kind of facets of the legal system? They've been asked to change them. How do you deal with that politically? It's a big challenge. And I think the more I see it, you look at kind of organised crime groups, you look at the security threats, those are ever more sophisticated. And so the kind of challenge for government and for police and prosecutors is, what can we do more? Just last week or the week before, I was at Europol and Eurojust with some colleagues, kind of doing a bit of engagement. And I mean, they're incredible organisations. They're doing a lot of work to keep us safe, but you see how much effort goes into them. And I think that's the point we're trying to put across. If you want to take part in that, join the civil service. You can either come as a lawyer, come as a policy official. There's a lot of people doing really fantastic work. And I think that's maybe what I didn't understand when I was at uni, is that there are people who, this is their jobs. Like, I was in charge of extradition from Scotland for 5 years. If you told me when I was 18 or 19, do you want to do extradition? I'd be like, what's that? Like, what is this? I think that's the joy I find of the public sector, that you can become a real expert in these like quite niche topics. The ones that you wouldn't necessarily think that exist anywhere else. And you get to meet some fantastic colleagues as well who also get to run these things and do cool stuff. So bear that in mind.
Thank you. And what skills do you think the most important for lawyers, even in your role or just in general as well?
I think being a lawyer is, I think the skills you need to have is a sense of curiosity, being curious about how do things work, being willing to go that extra mile to look through documents. It's not the most thrilling. I found an error on Westlaw the other day, and it was only because I sat for 5 hours looking at something. I was like, this doesn't make sense to me. So I had to go all the way back to the original printed version of an act and work it all out. And you find a mistake in Westlaw, that's intense geekery. But that became from a kind of maybe slightly obsessive aspect of my personality. But I wanted to find the answer. I had to understand how something worked. I could then explain it to people. I think lawyering is really about that. It surprises me, like a big part of my career and my life is just language learning. So speaking foreign languages and learning them. I think lawyering is quite similar to that. Like, you're looking at words and telling people what they mean. And that's obviously quite a reductive view of what lawyering is, but it is really just telling people, here's what some words mean. Thanks, this is the rule. There you go, have fun. And if you're into that, then try and learn a language, because it does start broadening your horizons. If you look at European Union legislation that is equally valid in the 23 official languages of the European Union, or take the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court, equally authoritative in the 5 official languages of the UN, and that always feels a bit underutilized as a source of legal reasoning. Are people really looking at what the French text says, or the German, or the Spanish, or the Chinese? It's obviously difficult if you don't speak those languages, but there's ways you can do it. And I think being in Brussels, you see how many people are lawyers in English without it being their first language, and the advantage that gives them, because they can draw upon these different linguistic heritages. So there's a skill there of curiosity, a skill there about thinking about words and thinking about how to present things. And I think something that always impresses me about lawyers is, or I'd like to think I aspire to this, not being afraid to ask questions. A lot of people can be quite scared to ask questions because they feel insecure, like maybe it makes them look silly. But the best lawyers I've ever met are the people that were asking actually really basic questions, because it's then would show maybe people in the room didn't understand the question they were asking, or what does that word mean, or where did that come from? And I think that can then become a sense of a source of empowerment, which is really quite important. So yeah, ask questions, be curious, and get to love words.
Thank you very much. So, looking back over your career so far, what's sort of been the most like rewarding moment in your career? If you could name one, or I'm sure there's been loads, but
Yeah, there's quite a lot. There's one where I need to be careful how I say it, but we, after quite a long time, we managed to put a very dangerous person in prison, through a lot of diplomacy, through a lot of multilingual work, a lot of dealing with a foreign country, its own political difficulties. That guy's now in prison, and um, that for me was such a tangible outcome of, a convicted child sex offender, wasn't in prison, he's now in prison. Job done as far as I was concerned, but it was a huge amount of effort. I mean, there's laws I can look at and I can see the influence I've had on them and say, like, that's the law of the land, and I made this little bit happen. Um, there's treaty negotiations. There's even events, like I've hosted formal events where there's ministers and people from the European Union and the UK government, and they're coming together, and you think, can I make this happen? That's great. But yeah, it's you try and find that in a kind of daily sense of what am I proud of, what am I chuffed with. I kept even for the early days of my career, I've kept a list on Google Docs of like stuff I'm proud of. So it helps with job applications, but also helps if I'm having a bad day. I can look and be like, oh, I did a cool thing. So keeping that list, every couple of weeks, something that I'm proud of, I'll be like, oh, I did that. That was a cool thing to do. No one else needs to see it. It's just for me. It keeps me kind of a bit grounded. So I'd recommend doing that. And it's funny to see kind of the progression from when I was an intern up to now. But that progression is also important.
perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you could go back to when you were first at university, what is one piece of advice you'd give a younger version of yourself?
Oh, don't worry about time. Oh, seriously, you're. I remember feeling an incredible time pressure as a young man around. Let's still like to think of a young man. The 4 years over 5 years, as if an extra year at uni was a bad thing. And now I see, like, the older I get, actually, a couple of years doing something that's not ideal isn't that significant investment. I give an example. When I went back to Scotland to become a solicitor, I jumped. I remember this was kind of explained to me. I jumped about 10 years ahead of my peers at the time in terms of grade in the civil service because I went in as a solicitor. So that 3 years I spent becoming a solicitor was worth 10 years in my career, roughly speaking. When you think about that, it's not actually as scary. So don't feel you're locked in. You can always change plans. You can always change the direction of your career. I felt uni was a little bit like this is the rest of your life, and it's not. You can change into different stuff. I know people that trained as doctors and become teachers. I've done different things. Most of my friends have done different things. So yeah, be hopeful. You can always change stuff.
Perfect. I think that's all the questions from us.
Okay, thank you so
That
much.
was absolutely amazing. Thank you very
Just
much.
stop the recording here and then